I played chess at every ELO from 1 to 1000. Now my actual ELO is around 1900, so I thought this would just be like a fun vacation, but players at all levels are quite a bit stronger than I thought. Especially around the 600 to 700 range, I was occasionally getting surprised by tactics that I had overlooked because I wasn't really paying attention to the board, and even though it didn't happen often, there's a handful of games that I straight up lost because my opponent spotted a weakness in my position and was able to exploit it. So for this video, I'm going to talk about what I learned from my little adventure, what players are good at, what they're bad at, and what everyone can do to improve. And because this is YouTube, I've divided my observations into a convenient numbered list. 1. People are pretty good at tactics. I don't know what they're feeding the kids these days, but it's working because players at all ELOs are able to spot tactics that are pretty deep. For example, in this game, where my opponent has played this nonsense pawn structure, I move my knight to e4 as just a general developing move, but I quickly realized that I've made a mistake. The pawn is defending the knight on e4, but it's also defending the knight on c4, and so when the bishop takes on c4, the pawn can't both capture that bishop and defend the other knight. So I actually end up going down a material here. On this board, my opponent takes advantage of my king on the open diagonal by pushing the queen forward and attacking both the king and the knight at the same time. And on this board, I try to develop my bishop with tempo on the queen, but after the pawn pushes to d5, the pawn is attacking the bishop, the queen is attacking the knight, and I can't save both pieces. Unless I were to play bishop to f5, which I missed over the board and I end up going down in material. So yeah, even down at like the 400 to 500 range, people are spotting tactics that surprise me, and they get the edge over me in some games if I'm not paying attention. Is this stuff that I could have seen if I were really focused and dial it in? Yeah, of course. But the whole point of chess is to take advantage of other people's mistakes, and they're good at that. They are taking advantage of my mistakes. So if that's the case, why did I still finish my run with like a 99% win rate? Well, it turns out there's more to chess than just tactics, as we're about to see. 2. People love their queen openings. It seems like almost every game I played up to like 800-ish, people love to move their queens on the second or third move, probably to try to score some quick wins against the f7 pawn, but obviously I've seen all of these tricks before and I can stop all of them really easily. This is probably the most naive version of this kind of trick. The queen comes out to h5 on move 2, attacking both the e pawn and the f7 pawn. A lot of players will have trouble finding a defense for both of these pawns, but I know from experience that you can simply move your queen to e7, where it defends both f7 and e5. Then, after your opponent inevitably has to move a different piece, you can then develop your knight forward attacking the queen, and if your opponent still tries to abuse you with the queen, you just develop your other pieces attacking it in different ways, and very quickly you will get a huge development lead. This attack uses a similar idea but a different move order, moving the knight out first onto f3 and then e5 in order to attack the f7 pawn again. However, because the knight has moved twice, it's very easy for me to move my knight forward and attack the h5 square so the queen can't access it anymore. And if the queen tries to come to f3 instead in order to attack my pawn, the knight is actually blocking it from getting any closer, so I'm completely safe from checkmate and my opponent has to figure out something else to do. This is the most interesting variation of queen aggression I've seen. My opponent moves the a pawn, the c pawn, and the e pawn in order to make space for the bishop and queen to line up on this diagonal and try to find checkmate on f2. I can imagine this blindsiding a lot of players because it's not immediately obvious what those two pieces are doing, but if you see the threat coming ahead of time, it's very easy to block this trick by pushing your d-pawn forward to d4, cutting off the diagonal, or by simply castling and having the rook and king protect the f2 square together. So even in its most advanced incarnation, queen aggression in the opening can't really do anything. So why do people keep playing these early queen openings when they're so bad and so easy to refute? My theory is that a lot of people don't learn chess by like studying books or whatever, they just kind of jump into games and see what works. And they see over and over again that people are winning with this early queen aggression because, you know, down at like 100 to 200, people don't know how to stop it. So they start playing it too, and they start scoring easy wins, and they start climbing up to like 300, 400, 500. But as they climb more and more, they run into more and more players who know how to deal with this early queen aggression, and they end up getting capped out at a certain level because the people they're playing against know how to deal with their strategy, and rather than adapt and do something else, they'll just keep trying it over and over again because it's working sometimes. Maybe it'll just keep working and I'll keep winning. But of course, if you approach chess with that mindset, you will always be capped at a certain level because you're not trying to do something more powerful and more interesting that makes you a better player. You're learning how to abuse weak players, but you're not learning how to become a better player yourself. And if that is how you study chess, you will always be stuck at like 500 to 600 and not be able to break out into a higher rating. And as we're about to see in the next section, most players below 1000 have not developed one of the core skills of chess: how to play the mid-game. I think for a lot of chess players, the hardest part of the game is right after the opening, where you've kind of developed a lot of your pieces, but you're not totally sure what to do next. This is where I see a lot of the most common mistakes at around the 600 to 700 level, which we're going to see over the next few games. One big mistake that people make is they like to push pawns forward at the expense of not developing their other pieces. So for example, in this game, my opponent is pushing down the queenside pawns to try to trap my dark square bishop, which obviously isn't going to work because I know the trap already, and all of these pawn pushes are at the expense of their other pieces. What my opponent really should be doing here is developing their dark square bishop, or their knight, or castling their king so that he's a little bit safer. Because my opponent does none of these things, I end up with a development lead which I then convert into a pawn later on in the game. This game is a really good example of why pushing pawns so much isn't really a good thing and not advancing your game plan. In this game, my opponent wastes a lot of time trying to use their C and D pawns to secure the center, while also pushing the H pawn in order to attack my king side. But because they have no pieces attacking my king side, they kind of don't really have any momentum to use. And meanwhile, I've used that time to develop my rooks to the center of the board and push in my pawns to break open the center and attack the enemy king. My opponent ends up blundering here and losing their queen, and it's a really easy cleanup for me from there. The lesson to take away here is that you should try to use your knights, bishops, and rooks to take up space instead of trying to push pawns. Pushing pawns can be okay if all your other pieces are well placed, but you certainly shouldn't be pushing pawns when you still have a knight and a bishop on the back rank. 4. Blind spots. I've noticed that my opponents have pretty consistent blind spots across all elos that kind of center around focusing on the last move that was played. For example, a really common theme is that players would lose material because they lose track of a piece that's far away from where the action is, so to speak. For example, on this board I offer my opponent a queen trade, and they want to decline it because they want to keep their queen on the board. However, what they don't realize is that this pawn that's supposed to be supporting the queen is actually pinned by my bishop on b6. So when I capture the queen, my opponent has no way to recapture, and I just have a queen for free. On this board, my opponent tries to move the knight out of danger, but moves it directly into range of my rook. And on this board, my opponent pushes the b pawn in an effort to liberate the rook from having to defend it. However, they forget that my bishop is on f3 and can simply capture the knight. Another thing that people tend to struggle with is pieces that defend backwards or just at an unexpected angle. For example, here, my opponent is threatening checkmate with their knight and queen on h7, but my knight is defending backwards, and when my opponent tries to play the checkmate, I simply capture with my knight, and my opponent is really embarrassed. And on this board, my opponent tries to move their knight forward to take up space, thinking that it's defended by the bishop, but I have a rook on b7 that adds another attacker to that square, so after takes, I end up ahead a minor piece. The cure here is pretty simple. Just make sure that you always check every single piece on the board before you make a move. A lot of the times you'll stop yourself from walking right into danger, and more importantly, when your opponent walks directly into one of your pieces, you can capture it much faster because of course you already know where everything is. 5. Endgames. Everybody sucks at endgames. I think below 300, I'm not even sure if people understand the concept of checkmate yet, because I played multiple games where I sacrificed every single piece of material on my board, and all my opponent tried to do was promote pawns and inevitably stalemate because they're not actually putting my king in check. I also played this game where my chat challenged me to win a game using only pawn moves, and I was able to push my c pawn all the way to the other side of the board, promote to a queen, and win the game with checkmate because my opponent just let me do that. It would have been so easy just to move the rook onto the same file as the pawn and just capture it because you're already up a queen. I don't understand. I don't know why you didn't just stop it. So obviously this is a really extreme example of poor endgame technique. However, even better players seem to struggle with endgames a lot. For example, in this game, my opponent managed to hold me to an even rook-pawn endgame, but they failed to control the c file and let me infiltrate on c7, taking a lot more pawns than my opponent ever should have allowed. Eventually, my opponent is forced to defend my a pawn that's about to promote, and they screw up the defense and give me a ladder checkmate on the a and b files. There's this famous quote by a guy named Richard Teichmann, whoever that is, that says that chess is 99% tactics, and there's an element of truth to that. The heart of chess is definitely the tactical game and trying to win material in the short term. However, I think beginner players take this a little bit too much to heart and study only tactics to the exclusion of everything else, to the point where they make really obvious mistakes that overshadow the clever tactics that they see. If you really want to improve at chess, the best thing to do is not another 100 puzzles on chess.com. The best thing to do is figure out why you keep losing your knight to a rook that's on the other side of the board. Tactics are a really important part of chess, but there's more to chess than tactics, and you should try to explore some of that. Anyway, that's all for this video. If you enjoyed your time here, make sure to like and subscribe. I'm going to work on a follow-up video that gives you a curriculum of what you should work on at every rating, so be on the lookout for that. Alright, that's all from me. Catch you later. Bye bye.